Can you describe for those who might be new to yoga, uh, why is it a good approach? Is there research supporting yoga and Parkinson's? And yeah, I'll follow up with some questions after that.
Sure. So I think that yoga is quite misunderstood. People have a sense that it's just the poses, it's just another exercise, just like, lifting weights in a gym. Yoga is part of this sort of larger tradition of Ayurveda, which is this sort of traditional Indian approach to healthcare. Just like in traditional Chinese medicine, there are certain sorts of facets. Many other healthcare systems outside of Western medicine have different approaches that are thousands of years old. So yoga is a part of this. Yoga has some poses, so we call those the asanas. So those are the sort of things that you can put your body into, and the movements that you can create between poses. There's also this sort of important aspect that I think is very powerful, which is the breath work. So this, what we call pranayama. So modulating breath around poses sometimes, or just by itself. So there are a number of things that you can do in yoga that affect breath. And this is very powerful, especially in Parkinson's patients, because breath and controlling your breath, being aware of your breath, is actually a very good way to sort of tap into the autonomic nervous system. So that's that nervous system that includes the sympathetic and parasympathetic aspects that can have, some sort of control over things like anxiety. They affect heart rate. It affects, blood pressure. It can affect respiratory rate, temperature. All these things can actually be powerfully modulated sometimes with controlling breath. And so we are not, as neurologists, the first people to realize this. I think the cardiologists have realized this. A number of other psychiatrists, psychologists use breath in trying to help with a host of symptoms that they take care of, including heart rate abnormalities. And so the autonomic nervous system is something that we can modulate kind of uniquely with the breath work that we see that we can use in yoga. And then the third component that I think is pretty important is the meditative aspect. So we have this sort of concept, which some people would call mindfulness, of paying attention in the moment to, within your sort of capacity to the thoughts in your mind, sort of what's happening, just sort of checking in your body, and that awareness sort of your present moment, your body sensations, your mind. That is all also part of yoga. And that can actually also be very powerful for a number of things. And mindfulness as a whole has been sort of separated and studied in ways, but within yoga practice, we have ways to get into the same spaces, and that can affect sometimes cognition even. So there's been some studies looking at mental state and memory, things like that, using meditation. It can affect sleep sometimes in a positive way. It can also affect anxiety and depression in positive ways. So these are actually all also very powerful. But when we look at just the things like the poses and the movements, I think we have some unique things just from those that are very helpful to our patients living with Parkinson's as well.
Tell us a little bit about what are some of the most important learnings that you have found from teaching yoga to people with Parkinson's and other neurological diseases?
So what have I found? I found that I think when we, the social connection piece is huge. I think that is one thing that I found. I think when the pandemic hit and we couldn't see our patients, and we were doing some symposiums where patients would come in and we would all be doing things together, either dance or boxing or yoga. And I think that, being disconnected from each other is profoundly, not good for our nervous system and for our brain in general. So I think that, that social piece, if you can get out and do something with a friend, even if you can't get to the yoga class, if you can get a friend to come over and you do it together, or your perhaps your care partner or your daughter, it's, I think, definitely beneficial, because you get the benefits of doing some group activity, and loneliness is very bad, in general for health and for our Parkinson's patients. So that's one thing I found. The second thing is that the mind and the body are very connected. So I think if you can help with calming the mind, help with calming that autonomic nervous system, it can actually be profoundly beneficial for people living with Parkinson's with their motor symptoms. And so often we look at something like tremor as something that we fixate on, but it's really that we have some anxiety underneath, or that we have some other sort of things that are weighing our minds down, distracting the mind. And so I think once we kind of tap into that and we realize sort of firsthand that, the breath can really change how I feel, and that just feeling sort of into my spaces in my body. And you realize, wow, like, I guess my heart rate was really high, at the beginning of this class. I guess when I was breathing, it was much faster. And now, at the end of the class, you're like, wow, this has transformed me from, where I was to something else. And that was something that you had control over actually within your own body, which is kind of a beautiful thing. So this doesn't require any fancy yoga pants or cool, pretty yoga mats or a gym membership or anything. It's something that's accessible, honestly, to all of us. And we can take that practice through to, honestly, even people who are in their last days of life. And I've, been able to breathe with people who are in hospice, in pain sometimes, not necessarily even from Parkinson's disease, but other problems that happen to family members or whatever, and they've passed. And yoga's been something that we could do even as a group together, even in those spaces, which I think is a really beautiful practice. So that's something that I think is really powerful. And I actually had a C-spine MRI myself recently, and I started to get quite anxious in the MRI scanner. And I was going to have a panic attack. Dr. Subramanian in the scanner having a panic attack. Not great, sort of mentally sort of thinking about that. So I realized my heart rate was going faster, and, I was just, claustrophobic. And so I really started to rely on this breath work, kind of just thinking about these things that I've practiced not in that same space, right? So you kind of have to practice. You kind of have to get these things going on a daily basis. It becomes part of a regular thing that we drizzle in from, if we can, diagnosis. And then when you need these things, they're there in your pocket to sort of use. And I can say that for me, in my own lived experience, I've really been much more open-minded to how powerful these things are, probably much more powerful sometimes than the pills that we give or anything else that we do. The other thing that I think the mind-body practices do, which is very practical for this day and age, is that we really literally unplug completely, right? We put our cell phones away. We turn off our devices. We're not in front of our computer screen necessarily when we're doing some of these things in the same way that we would be if we were, binge watching Netflix or scrolling through news and things like that. So I think that if you can, I think Zoom is a great technology and has increased our accessibility to many people who would never be able to come and see us, in some of the places that we practice medicine or do some of these classes. However, if you're able to really get out and disconnect, put your devices completely away in a studio, I find that people are just so amazed at how like an hour away from all their, multitasking and all this sort of digital craziness is just also very therapeutic. So I think if you can add a nature piece, if you can add being present with somebody that you love or a friend or a social interaction, I think that there's so many benefits of these sorts of things to, just the whole person, the whole body, the mind, and the autonomic nervous system, as well as, your muscles and your, sort of stiffness, slowness, things like that, because we're doing these stretches and can really help with posture and a number of other things that affect specifically our motor function in Parkinson's.